my teacher friends, let's do this. Let's tackle the enigma of 6-7. So in this particular writing workshop, I have an argument-based synthesis paper in which we are going to unpack this profound profundity, 6-7. So I have 3 modeled essays that I'm going to go over today in this writing workshop that I wrote just to demonstrate how to do argumentative synthesis. I also have an annotation exercise that will help your kids transfer their annotations into some good textual support in their essay. So before I dive in, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So I typically post 2 videos a week on Saturday and Sunday, and you may have seen me around the Facebook groups in referencing those slides. Everything that you see forthcoming in this writing workshop is down below in the video's description. And you can also find the articles that I'm referring to in my essay. So without further ado, let's take a look at the prompt. It says, in recent months, a peculiar phrase has echoed across TikTok, Instagram, and high school hallways. 6-7. The phrase traces back to Skrilla's song Doot Doot 6-7, where the rapper chants the numbers. On its own, the lyric seems meaningless, yet it became viral shorthand after being tied to NBA star LaMelo Ball, who stands 6'7". Soon, students were joking, captioning memes, and tossing 6-7 into conversations. But why do such slang phrases spread? Some say it's humor, others say it's nonsense for nonsense sake, and still others point to how slang signals belonging. As one commentator noted, what matters is not what 6-7 literally means, but how saying it signals you're in on the joke. So the rest of the prompt goes like this. Your task. Write a well-developed essay in which you explain why slang terms like 6-7 take hold among young people. Use at least 3 of the sources provided, so there are 6. Include 1 paragraph that applies the issue to your own school. How do students in your community use 6-7 in similar slang? What role does it play in your culture? Synthesize the sources with your own reasoning to make a clear, evidence-based argument. So as always, and again, those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that I Bob Ross my instruction. And what that means is I get to the proverbial canvas and easel and I paint, and I air quote that. So I write directly in front of my students using my heuristics. Bob Ross, every time he tackled a natural landscape, used something known as the wet on wet technique. And for our purposes, for the introductory paragraph, I use the inverted thesis and the declarative thesis. Body paragraphs, I use something called the syllogistic method. And I'll walk you through 3 such essays that employ those heuristics. So before we talk about writing, we got to get through the annotation exercise. And I came up with something really simple for this. So some of you saw my post from the other week with my Amazon cart annotation exercise, which was pretty cool. I got a lot of really positive feedback on that. So it's borrowing from that. So the 6-7 synthesis packet annotation challenge. It reads like this. Before writing, you'll annotate all 6 sources using the color-coded system below. The goal is to practice noticing different kinds of evidence so that you can later select the best ones for your essay, right? That's kind of the point of annotation. So what I've done for my students is I've printed the 6 sources and I've given them a box of crayons in order to do this exercise, but you can use colored pencils, highlighters, whatever you want for it. So here's the color code and the definitions and the origins for each one. So it says, highlight where the source explains where 6-7 comes from, what it literally means, or how it was used in its original context. Green is going to be the social or psychological insights of the 6-7 phenomena. So I'm asking them to highlight that explains why slang spreads, identity, group, belonging, humor, psychology. Pink is going to be humor, playfulness. Highlight moments that show the silliness, rhythm, and nonsense side of slang. And they're going yellow for the application to school life, highlight any details that could be applied to how slang works in your own community. And then margin symbols I want them to use. So quote worth using whenever you see a sentence that would make a strong direct quote in your essay, star it. So that's kind of the color code system that we'll be using. And I'll show you how I approached annotations and transfer them to my writing in just a minute. So the step-by-step directions. Read each source carefully, go through all 6 sources provided in your packet, annotate with colors, apply the color code system above as you read each source. Every source should have at least one highlight of each relevant color. And then that's pretty much, the gist of it. So I'm asking them to choose 2 double stars. After finishing all 6 sources, look back and select your 2 favorite quotes, the ones you are most likely to use in your essay. So we're going to write a 4-paragraph essay. So I'm going to have them do that twice so that 2 quotes go into each body paragraph at bare minimum. So once you're through with the annotations, you got to ask the next logical question. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? Those that are familiar with my work know these heuristics, so you can skip this part of the program if you want. But I use 2 heuristics, the declarative thesis and the inverted thesis. The declarative is when you just begin with a thesis, just boom, out of the gate, you answer the prompt. In terms of context and background, you're going to hear me refer to something that I call setting the GPS. So typically in an introductory paragraph, you hint or allude or give mention to where you're going in body paragraph 1 and body paragraph number 2. That's what I mean by context background. I know some teachers prefer to call it a GPS, and my younger students tend to identify with that a little easier than context and background. I also want to see some tier 2 level vocabulary in here. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. It is an academic essay. I know it's a silly topic, but we do have an academic audience. In my Nuance Academy that I run throughout the school year, I go over sentence constructs and sentence types. So I want to see really good voice rhythm and flow in here. I'm trying to get my kids away from that droning ... rhythm that just dropping a whole bunch of independent clauses creates. So really want them to hone in on some style points here. And then my introductions are always 4 sentences long, no more, no less. You can flip that declarative and call it inverted. And the only difference here is that you end with the thesis. So you take the essential questions from the prompt and just answer them last. Everything else remains the same. So that might be a little nebulous and pie in the sky. So let's unpack this and take a look at 3 exemplars that I wrote. So I emphasize this a lot with my students. You have to know your direction before you write. Where's body paragraph 1 going to go? What are you covering? What are you addressing? And where is body paragraph 2 going? And those are going to be the cardinal points that get set in the GPS. So let's model this. Here's number 1. Slang has always been more than a string of random sounds. It is a coded language of belonging. So you can see immediately I'm flexing some sentence patterns here. I want my kids to use their semicolons and their colons and their em dashes and all that stuff. So I do a lot with grammar, punctuation, syntax. The viral phrase 6-7 may appear nonsensical at first glance, but its popularity among teens reveals a deeper purpose. Whether through humor or shared confusion, slang like this creates an inside joke that separates those in the know from outsiders. Therefore, the rise of 6-7 illustrates how youth slang functions both as a marker of group identity as a tool for playful self-expression in school culture. So the hardest thing for kids to identify in my exemplars is the GPS. So you can kind of get that in the last sentence there. This would be a inverted thesis. So where it says slang functions both as a Marker of group identity is body paragraph 1, and then tool for playful self-expression is body paragraph number 2. You can also see that sentence 1 is radically different than sentence 2, right? You have to have varied sentence patterns, otherwise you're going to have that droning rhythm. 3 is different than 2, and then 4 is different than 3. I want my kids to begin to avoid parallel structure in their writing, because that's when you get that deafening, monotonous tone. You can see that I do have a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary in here. Nothing over the top. Words like nonsensical is something that's pretty good. Illustrate. So I talk to my students about really good adjectives and verbs. Keep those popping. So let's see it again, really to demystify it. I'll paint another one. And as always, I hearken back to this. Before you write, you need to know your direction. So here's exemplar number 2. Every generation invents slang that baffles adults while bonding peers from groovy to lit. Today, phrases like 6-7 thrive not because of their dictionary definition, but because of the way they sound, circulate, and connect. So that would be body paragraph number 1. In memes, conversations, or even hallways, they value lies in rhythm, repetition, and recognition. So one of the things that I've been showing my students how to do is trio in sentence. So look at this. You got rhythm 1, repetition 2, recognition 3. So begin to play with those patterns. And I have some really excellent resources in my YouTube channel on sentence patterns. I think the one that is most engaging is the awkward family photo. And I created a user manual of the 20 sentence patterns and a really neat exercise that has kids kind of being like yearbook editors, where they caption these awkward family photos using a particular sentence pattern, and they go through all 20. Ultimately, 6-7 spread not for meaning, but for belonging. So that's where paragraph number 2 comes in. A pattern that explains both its meme-driven internet rise and its adoption in everyday student culture. So I'm always doing the same thing, right? Cook the sentence structure, set the GPS, a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary, 4 sentences, either lead with the thesis or end with the thesis. It doesn't matter where it goes. So students, yes, you can do this. It's pretty easy. Teachers, you might want to model it a couple of more times for your students live on the spot. But just to really shore it up, let's take a look at number 3. Slang can confuse outsiders precisely because it is not meant for them. So note that that's an independent clause there. We don't want to do that again in the next sentence. To many adults, 6-7 is just a lyric without context, yet to students it signals humor, 1, membership, 2, and 3, shared understanding. So I want to model what I want to see in student writing, right? Kids need good writing to produce good writing. What looks like nonsense actually reveals an intentional social logic. So that's an independent clause. 4th sentence should be different. And I can just see with my eye already. It's a nice longer sentence. In this way, the 6-7 phenomena shows how slang thrives both by offering an in-group identity and by evolving into playful traditions within school communities. So this is just like number 1, sample number 1. It's inverted. Look at the GPS. So it's a phenomena that shows how slang thrives both by offering 1, an in-group identity, so that's the first paragraph, and 2, second paragraph, by evolving into playful traditions within school communities. So that's kind of what we're looking for in either a declarative or an inverted thesis. So teachers, if you're showing this to your students, have your students give it a whirl right now, pause the video and have them try it, or you can just kind of facilitate the class with my slides. And one of the things that I do is always take a look at student samples. I just call upon some kids to anonymously submit them to me, and then I plug them into a Canvas slide, and we'll review them for a whole class instruction. Great way to peer edit. And I'm a firm believer that the more good writing students see, the better they become. They need to see good models. So maybe you want to take like 3, 4, or 5 and just project them. So intros are done, which takes us to the next logical question. So how do I write the body paragraphs? I alluded to this already. My students are going to use something known as the syllogistic method. It comes from Aristotle, it's from the Aristotelian tradition. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town boys would go there to learn about oration, polemics, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, and they'd often throw out their own juicy essential questions, which we see in some seminal texts like Plato's Republic, in which he hurls the question, what is justice? And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, noted that some students could do this with relative ease, some struggled, and some just tank bombed it. And he asked the question to himself, what are the really good orators doing? So he kind of studied the inner machinations of their minds. And then one day he had this big eureka moment. And he said, aha, I got it. The really gifted orators are doing something called the syllogistic method. It's kind of a mathematical, calculative approach to logic. And that's the kicker about writing. Good writing is good thinking. Good thinking is good writing. So all we're going to do with this heuristic is teach kids how to capture their brilliant thoughts on paper. So a syllogism is when you go from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say to you in premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all nod your head and say, yep, Christian, you are correct. And then if I follow it up with some textual support that goes like this, we're going to draw a natural conclusion, a logical conclusion. If I say, this morning I walked into my kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and I noticed that Pickles, my dog, was underneath the kitchen sink. And I said, oh no, Pickles. And he pulls his head out of the cupboard and he's got white powder all over his gruzzle and his muzzle. And I'm like, last night I put arsenic beneath the kitchen sink because we have a rat infestation problem. You're going to automatically assume, uh-oh, Christian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog, Pickles, is going to die. And we created a thought bubble there. It's a cogent argument from top to bottom. And that's what we're looking for in student writing. I call it cogency. A lot of teachers refer to it as the line of reasoning. So whatever, coinage you want to use, by all means, use it. In terms of morphing this into a heuristic for the purposes of doing argumentative synthesis, this is what we got. First premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. And I'm going to model this 3 times for you, because if the first premise goes awry, then the whole body paragraph is kind of go in the tanker. So there's some math to this. The first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. I don't want my kids quoting. I don't want my kids paraphrasing. I just want arguments that articulate a why reason. In the 4th sentence, they're going to begin the second premise. And here's where the textual support comes in. They have to quote and paraphrase. I'm going to require that my students do it a minimum of 2 times. In my models, I think I do it 3 times because I want to show my advanced writers how to do that. But at bare minimum, especially this early in the academic year, 2 quotes, and then we'll go over how to use our embedded quotes and our quote frames and all of that stuff, and how to do citations in just a minute. So when you're done with that, you got to wrap up the body paragraph with a conclusion. And I do not mean the conclusion of the essay. I mean the conclusion of the body paragraph. And this is where the textual analysis is going to come in. And you want to link, echo, and I call it the promise of the first premise. Keep the promise of the first premise and circle back to the first premise and to the thesis and to the prompt. So it all comes full circle. All of that has a little bit of math involved in it. You might be asking, how many sentences is that going to take? That's pretty ambitious. Typically, students write 10 to 12 sentences per body paragraph. So the question becomes, how do I write a first premise? Let me show you 3 times how I do this. So example number 1, you have to, again, set your GPS. So you go back to your thesis and say, what's the first cardinal point that I'm directing my reader to in the thesis? So in exemplar number 1, It's focused on identity and belonging. So I have to write a first premise about identity and belonging. So 3 sentences, no quotes, no paraphrases, just straight up argumentation. So here it is. Language is not only a tool for communication, but also a badge of belonging. When young people adopt a phrase like 6-7, they are not emphasizing meaning, but signaling membership in a community that understands the reference. Thus, slang spreads because it creates an in-group that thrives on shared codes, humor, and subtle exclusion of outsiders. So again, I'm still modeling writing here. I got shared codes 1, humor 2, subtle exclusion of outsiders 3. So you can still cook those trios, and the same rules apply, right? You want to stagger your sentence patterns, keep your vocab up without overdoing it. So you can see in this, at the exclusion of everything else, right? You have to have a singular focus. That first premise only touches upon identity and belonging, right? So just to recap this, first premise, 3 sentences argue the why reason. And then I'll show you how we move on from here in just a second. But you have to ask yourself, what's the promise of the first premise? And that predicates or kind of presupposes what the quote selection is going to be. Now, the kid gets back into their color-coded annotations, and I think it was red for this. They're going to go look for red quotes and or paraphrases that they're going to plug in. Ideally, I want to see 2 in there. So first premise can be a little confusing, so let's see it again. All right, this is for my second thesis. Example 2 is going to focus on humor and playfulness. So at the exclusion of everything else, no quotes, no paraphrases, I just got to focus on humor and playfulness. Slang often survives because it entertains. A phrase like 6-7 catches on not for its literal significance, but for the rhythm, absurdity, and mean value that make it fun to repeat. So I did my trio there. Therefore, young people sustain slang because it delivers laughter and playful energy that standard language cannot provide. So now what I need to do to keep the promise of the first premise is get at least 2 quotes that are about humor and playfulness. And I don't remember my color-coded system. Let's say, for example, it was yellow, right? They go find the yellow quotes. They need a minimum of 2 of them, and then they just kind of quote select so that everything stays germane and linked, logical, cogent. I always do things 3 times, so let's see another one, and this one focuses on school and social context. In school hallways and classrooms, slang is both performance and connection. Phrases like 6-7 serve as conversational shortcuts, 1, inside jokes, 2, or ways of breaking tension during the day, right? So now I've promised all those things. All my quotes and paraphrases are going to touch upon that trio. As a result, slang functions as a cultural glue in student life, allowing peers to recognize one another through shared expression. So with each of these, what I do is I pause, and then I have students look at our annotations, and I'll split the class into 3, and I'll say, group number 1, you're responsible for first premise 1. Group 2, you're responsible for first premise 2. Group 3, you're responsible for first premise number 3. And they have to tell me what kind of quotes I have to use to stay cogent in there. And I just have that big easel paper, and we write them up on 3 separate sheets of easel paper, and then I plug them into my samples. So let's take a look at the 4th sentence, which begins the second premise. And this is where the support and analysis comes in. So 4th sentence, you should just get quoting right out of the gate, right? So let's write the rest of exemplar number 1. It goes like this. To see this in action, consider what Case Western linguists observed when they noted, slang connects us to groups we belong to or want to belong to and separate us from groups we want to be different from. Source E. So I have a heuristic within the heuristic that I call the 5-word rule. I want to get my kids away from quote dumping. And one easy way to do that is to institute what I call the 5-word rule. If the student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, the quotes should sound conversational, right? And then you can talk about, the quote, the quotation going on the inside, parentheses, source, period on the outside with your kids. When you quote, you got to analyze the quote. You just can't dump it. So let me unpack it. In other words, and I teach my kids stems like that after a quote. It's an easy transition out of the quote. Just say, in other words. So slang is not about words alone, but about stacking one's place in a social world. The very act of repeating 6-7 signals that a student is current with trends, aware of online culture, and willing to be playful with language. Social psychologists echo this point by arguing that individuals define themselves based on group memberships, seeking to enhance self-esteem by identifying with in-groups and differentiating from out-groups. So a couple of things here. Early in the academic year, students typically will quote and then they only have one sentence of analysis after the quote. I modeled with source E. I have a couple of sentences to unpack that quote. So you got to be thorough in that. I also modeled here how to use the ellipses within a quote so you can explain that to them. And then, like I said earlier, all my citations are done correctly. So wherever you quote, you just slap down the quote letter for it. So yet again, I'm at that place where I have to unpack the quote. The phrase 6-7 then becomes a shortcut to show you are in rather than out. Furthermore, the vagueness of its meaning only heightens its role as a shibboleth, something understood by insiders but baffling to outsiders. Even if parents or teachers overhear the phrase, their confusion reaffirms its purpose as a marker of youth culture. Ultimately, slang like 6-7 endures because its primary function is identity. It says, I belong here, even when the words themselves carry no fixed meaning. So you can see there at the end, right, my first premise promised to talk about belonging. So in the conclusion, you got to talk about belonging. It all goes full circle. And in the end, that would be about 10 to 12 sentences. So let's do it again just to shore it up, solidify it, and take a look at exemplar number 2. So again, I'm at the 4th sentence, which is where the second premise begins. Usually start quoting in the 4th line. As one commentator explained in E! Online, there's no real meaning to it. It is a number that is funny to say, something you're just trying to use to get somebody to reference the number 6-7. So I use the 5-word rule again. What seems like nonsense is in fact a clever cultural move, saying 6-7 invites a chuckle, a head shake, or a playful response. So again, I'm just showing my kids how to do trios. Like that's one of the sentence patterns that we've been using quite a bit lately. Similarly, Business Insider emphasizes that the lack of meaning is part of its appeal. Source D. That paradox, its emptiness as its strength, shows how humor itself fuels the spread of language. So one of the things too that I want to talk about with my students, do you see how source D and source B are conversating with each other? They're kind of holding down the same conversation. So I want my students to build upon their quotes. D and B need to be in unison with each other. And when we pull in C, C needs to be chit-chatting back to D and B. So that paradox, its emptiness as its strength, shows how humor itself fuels the spread of language. Unlike dictionary words, slang thrives on sounding catchy or absurd in context. Parade adds that people today say 6-7 in the way the song says it, suggesting that the rhythm of the chant itself is part of the joke. Source C. Whenever you quote, you unpack it, and you need like 2 or 3 sentences for that. In this sense, students are not quoting for content, but for cadence, playing with sound as much as meaning. The humor of repeating 6-7 may seem pointless to outsiders, but to insiders, it is a bonding laugh. That laughter is precisely what sustains the phrase, giving it cultural energy long after the original song faded from view. And again, 10 to 12 sentences. So you're seeing a trend here. One of the things I do is break away from the one sentence of analysis. Quote, one sentence, quote, one sentence, quote, one sentence, right? That doesn't have enough textual analysis in it to really sustain a cogent argument or build or flesh out the line of reasoning. So that's something I will emphasize in my exemplars when I teach this. And just to do 3 to really, really hammer it home, let's take a look at exemplar 3. Fourth sentence begins the second premise. One article in People observes that on TikTok and Instagram, the sound became popular backing for videos, often tied to basketball clips of LaMelo Ball, who stands 6'7" tall. Source A. In school, that digital reference transforms into a social cue. A student mutters 6'7" at a basketball game and others laugh knowingly. The phrase became shorthand for more than just a number. It signals cultural literacy. Likewise, Parade notes that, similar to how millennials would say 21 or 1738, people today say 6'7" in the way the song says it. Source C. Right? Same old pattern here, right? Quote, analyze, quote, analyze. This shows how slang from music often migrates into casual school conversation, becoming part of the daily rhythm of talk. Within hallways, repeating 6'7" can break awkward silences. Enliven group chats, that's number 2, or 3, serve as an icebreaker between peers. Importantly, these uses show how students integrate digital culture into physical spaces, reinforcing that slang is not confined to screens but animates real-life community. And then here's where we wrap it all back to the first premise, the thesis statement, and to the prompt. In short, phrases like 6'7" survive at school because they thrive in the quick exchanges, the joking asides, and the shared need for connection that defines student culture. Again, 10 to 12 sentences. So you literally do the same thing every single time you tackle a body paragraph. And this is what I love about the syllogistic method, is that it just takes the guesswork out of the equation for kids. If you model it enough for them, if they practice it, they'll be good to go. So question becomes, it's a 4-paragraph essay. Christian, you only have the intro and one body done. What do you do next? Ta-da, you just bust out another syllogism, right? So you take a look at the next GPS coordinate in the thesis and you riff around that. Same old system, right? First premise, second premise, conclusion. So we got to wrap the essay up and throw a conclusion on it. So I have some stems that I use early in the year, and I always give this analogy to my students. Conclusions are kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display, the big encapsulation, the all-encompassing moments of the piece. So stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, kind of set the trigger for them to be all-encapsulating. So here are a few examples. And that just needs to be like 3 or 4 sentences. That's it. In no other words, slang like 6'7" demonstrates how language thrives even when stripped of clear definition. What matters is not the number itself, but the social life it gains in memes, music, and school hallways. By blending humor with identity, the phrase evolves into a badge of belonging. Ultimately, the enigma is resolved. 6'7" endures because it embodies the playful, connective spirit of youth culture. So one of the things I did there at the end was end with a duo, playful, connective, right? Because you don't want to over trio. You got to do duos and trios for variety. I always tell my kids repetition's the bane of the author's existence. You don't even want to be repetitive at sentence level. Here's another one. Simply said, 6'7" proves that meaning's not always required for words to matter. Students repeat it not for clarity, but for the laughter, rhythm, and recognition it brings. So trio there. In this way, the phrase's endurance reveals the deeper purpose of slang, to connect peers and define community. Far from nonsense, 6-7 is a reminder that language works best when it brings people together. And then we're going to use a different stem at the end of the day in the third one. So at the end of the day, the rise of 6-7 shows that slang is as much about culture as it is about words. Teenagers embrace it to signal identity, to entertain one another, and to translate digital trends into school life. So you can see here, I'm really hammering home how to pattern sentences. What seems meaningless to outsiders becomes meaningful through group use. The phrase lasts because its power lies not in definition, but in connection. All right, we are at the end. Happy teaching, happy writing. If for any reason you need to reach out to me with any questions or requests for future writing workshops, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com is a good email address to contact me. Note that I do PD sessions quite a bit. So I teach full time in the upstate New York area, but often hop in the RV and come visit teachers and departments at their schools to do PD sessions. And if you're interested in that, give me an email and we can talk about your specific needs and what I have to offer. I also do a lot of one-on-one teacher training and master classes as well. So if you want to work with a few people on particular skill sets or, pedagogical approaches, give me an email and we'll see if we can work together. So that's it for this one. Hope you like it. Hope you found it to be useful. I think it's going to be definitely an entertainer and one that students are going to do some good writing for. Take care for now.